am a fourth-year PhD student at the University of Washington in Seattle in the Department of Communication, and I'm presenting my piece in progress titled Mixed Race Futurisms, Making Space for Multiplicity in Racial Discourse. In this piece, I am presenting or trying to argue for the concept of mixed race futurisms. I'm going to refer to it as MRF. It's holding space to both acknowledge the restraints placed on and control over our racial discourse, imaginations, and identity formation by socially constructed systems rooted in white supremacy, and enact invention, multiplicity, and the making of liberatory futures outside of rigid and singular racial discourse. So MRF, to me, is about unpacking the contradictions and confusion often associated with being multiple in a world that only prioritizes singularity and still envisioning and imagining a future that is more expansive. So using the speculative art of La Malinche, a historical figure, I examine how representations of her illustrate and practice MRF, and then I use phenomenological analysis to reflect on those depictions and how they impact or hold a mirror to the reflections and possibilities in my own performance of cultural identity as a mixed-race Mexican-American. Briefly, La Malinche, also known as Malintzin or Doña Marina, is a historical figure who has been the center of scholarly conversation for decades. She was a Mayan slave who was gifted to Hernan Cortés, along with a group of women as part of the surrender of the indigenous peoples of Tabasco during the conquest of Mexico. And discovering that she was bilingual in Yucatec and Nahuatl, the Spaniards used her as an interpreter between them and the indigenous folk across Mexico. And so her position has made her sort of a contentious figure in history because she's labeled as the sort of traitor, sellout, and that has aided in the conquest of Mexico. And at the same time, a lot of Chicana feminist scholars have reclaimed her and sought to sort of challenge these labels by identifying her as a survivor of really sort of traumatic and extreme violence of colonization. And so her story, I think, depicts a lot of what her descendants actually have faced as the result of mixing. On the one hand, being sort of the vehicle for diluting indigeneity due to proximity to whiteness, but then on the other hand, being sort of transcendent race and being a bridge for all racial conflict. And so she is either like a traitor or she's a survivor, and these two conceptualizations can be really extreme. And I think that these are seen in a couple of images or paintings that I found in a recent exhibit titled Traitor Survivor Icon, The Legacy of La Malinche, which was an exhibit that was moving through Southwest US through different museums. And there are three paintings in particular that spoke to me. Santa Barraza's La Malinche, Antonio Ruiz's El Sueño de la Malinche, Malinche's Dream, and Robert Butrion's Malinche y Pocahontas, Chismeando con Power Books, Malinche and Pocahontas Gossiping with Power Books. And in these pieces, I sort of examine how her representations illustrate and practice mixed race futurisms. I do this because as a mixed race Mexican American, there are very few scripts that exist in the world to help me perform being mixed and mestiza. Due to the strict racial categories that separate cultural and racial identities, my construction of self as part black, part white, part Mexican has been like collecting shards of a broken mirror. Finding reflections of myself in pieces of different identities and collecting them to create my visualization and performance of being mixed and multicultural. And so these three pieces offer a way of seeing Malinche and then thus myself, and I'm introducing and conceptualizing mixed race futurisms as a way to understand my place in and outside of racial discourses, but also consider radical futurities. And I argue that conceptualizing of MRF will allow for a fuller understanding of racial identity and the future of racial performance. Mixed race futurism is, the lineage of it extends as a branch of Afrofuturistic literature, fictions, and research. Afrofuturism has a lot to do with understanding and creating narratives that insist on who we've been and where we've traveled as an integral component of who we can become, and also even just that radical act of conceiving of a future in which we continue to exist. These are past-future visions. So in other words, to understand the past as a part of the future is not only to understand the effects of oppression and violence, but also to reclaim what was once destroyed in order to subvert and present present social systems and find alternative ways to dismantle those systems without using them as tools, right, as Lord says. This is why I mark the beginning of mixed-race futurisms with Malintzin, with La Malinche, and why conceptualizing it includes speculative artwork of her, because I think this artwork represents past-future visions of who she was and who we can become and who she is and how she informs us now. So she is kind of a futuristic visionary through this work, and the artist as well. So I identify those scripts available for cultural performance of mixed race identity in this artwork and how much I've internalized and absorbed, and then also consider how I might conceive beyond. And so one of the things that I notice in Santa Rabasa's art piece is Malintzin's proximity to whiteness has vilified her throughout history as a traitor and a sellout, right? Because these narratives, as her descendants, our allegiances are questioned because we become suspect for occupying the bridge position, something that Kaufman Mormon wrote in 2010. Her descendants are automatically assumed to be sort of traitors. And I've encountered and internalized this suspicion throughout my life because I'm fair-skinned and white passing, and I sometimes feel like my light skin represents the success of the colonial project, right? The success of this dilution of indigeneity and of anti-blackness. And so that's why I'm sort of drawn to this particular image, because in the image, I don't know, for those of you who can see, La Malinche takes up a lot of space, and cradled in her bosom is her son, who she had with Hernan Cortés. In the image, her son is depicted with very fair skin and red hair, sort of like representing his father, but her body is in between them. Her body is in between a lot of violence that is going on in the background, as if she's sort of like shielding him, protecting him, trying to claim him in any way that she possibly can. And even though she cannot escape it, she's almost trying to protect him from it, even though his own like phenotypical presentation perpetuates it in a weird way, right? Like, and represents again the success of the colonial project, and therefore the violence behind her has the possibility of being the violence of her future because of her son. The artwork is speculative, not because the events in the foreground, the violence of the coloniality didn't happen, but because it's imagining she has the power to shield him from that future. And Barraza represents mixed-race futurisms because she acknowledges the past and implications of Malintzin's history, while also imagining and materializing her in a portrayal that turns her back to that past and focuses her attention on her son, her future, and considers, you know, what possibilities he has even in his proximity to whiteness, which is something that a lot of mixed race folks experience, that sort of suspicion to that proximity, because there is a lot of immediate criticism surrounding if you claim the mixed race identity, you're almost claiming the desire to be white, right? And so I feel like this piece sort of speaks to that, and it speaks to me because my proximity has made me scared that people will automatically assume I choose whiteness and would rather be white. And I used to carry a lot of like anger and guilt for that and not looking like her, because if I don't look like her, then I don't belong to her, and instead I belong to the oppressor and the colonial project. And I think that what I've come to realize is that there's a difference between being proximal to whiteness and choosing it. And we assume that she chose it rather than question the conditions that led to her choice. And we assume she prefers whiteness rather than wonder if she had any choice at all. And so throughout my life, I've sort of encountered a single phrase that always unsettles me where I enter into spaces like, oh man, wait a second, you're mixed, I thought you were white. Where people, and they say that, and it makes me feel like, that they made the choice for me. And I understand the narratives and constructions that lead people to make those assumptions, but racial singularity locks me into a category, and I have such a hard time breaking out of it. So I sprinkle Spanish words into my everyday vocabulary. I amp up my curl routine. I start wearing headscarves and my grandmother's African prints and huelipes and my abuelita's jorongos. Anything to make people pause and question where they make space for me in their mental categories. And I think that is that moment of confusion that interrupts the strict racial hierarchies, makes room for change and flexibility, which is where mixed race futurisms enters. Another piece that I think really speaks to this is sort of considering the transcendence of race that I think Marlene Seen represents in another depiction. In this image, she's like laying on the bed, and she's covered in like earth, and emerging from her body is this sort of like peaceful, utopic Spanish village. And it's almost as if it's called El Sueño de la Maniche. It's like she's dreaming this into life. She's dreaming this future into life. And what's key about this image is that she's actually dreaming a Spanish future into life. And so I want that to be really clear about when we think about mixed race futurisms, of just how internalized a lot of these, like, the racial logic is, even in her own vision, as far as she could conceive in this artistic depiction, as far as she could conceive was still just controlled by dominant expectations of what a utopia could look like. And a lot of that can be internalized through mixed folks as well. I don't ignore the fact that I'm light-skinned and white passing, right? I don't ignore the fact that my flexibility and fluidity has less to do with being mixed and more to do with being a safe, like, person of color, right? To enter into spaces. And so it just makes me like pause and reflect even more about these tensions that take up space in my body, and all of the histories that are aligned with it. And so I think as my time is wrapping up, one of the things that I would like to do with mixed race futurisms is just think about like what self-determination would look like, and what moments of tension we can still pull on, right? Like in this space, I've talked about mixed race and mestiza as something that is, I inhabit both of at the same time, and can be really, but pull from two extremely different histories. And so making more opportunities to be more expansive in our language uses. And I think this image is a good one. It has sort of a role play where Marlene Seen is chatting with Pocahontas to bridging peacemaking women in history, and it's just like this really imaginative, speculative, like, what would they talk about? How would they compare notes? What would they say to each other? How would they explain what happened to them or what they did and the choices they made? And if we give them that opportunity in this like one scenario, what would it look like to give ourselves the same opportunity as well? So thank you very much.